We see a completely non-racial society. We don't believe, for instance, in the so-called guarantees for minority rights, because guaranteeing minority rights implies the recognition of...
The story of Steve Biko is the story of courage in the face of an oppressive system. It begins in South Africa, a land rich in culture, history, and resilience, but also scarred by one of the most brutal systems of racial segregation the world has ever known: apartheid. Steve Biko, born on December 18, 1946, in King Williamstown, now called Khonsa, entered the world during a time when the color of one's skin dictated everything: where you could live, what schools you could attend, and even which beaches you were allowed to walk on. Apartheid was not just a policy. It was a system meticulously designed to strip the dignity of Black South Africans, to remind them at every turn that they were considered inferior. The system was enforced by laws that dictated where Black people could live, where they could work, what they could study, and even who they could marry. White minority rulers wanted total control, and they achieved it by legislating separation. This system was called apartheid, an Afrikaans word meaning apartness. But amid this atmosphere of repression, voices began to rise. One of the clearest and most powerful of these voices belonged to Bantu Steve Biko. Expelled from high school for his political views, young Biko refused to be silenced. He moved to St. Francis College in Natal, a liberal boarding school, where he graduated in 1966. From there, he entered the University of Natal Medical School, but even in his pursuit of education, his heart was firmly set on justice. At university, he joined the National Union of South African Students, a group that was multiracial and advocated for equal rights. But Biko quickly saw a flaw. He believed that as long as the organization was led primarily by white liberals, it would not truly empower Black people. He realized that liberation could not come from asking permission to be included in a white-dominated society. Liberation had to be rooted in self-worth, in the recognition that Black South Africans had dignity, culture, and power of their own. In 1968, Steve Biko co-founded the South African Students Organization, SASO. This group was entirely led by Black students, and it was built on the philosophy of Black consciousness. The idea was simple yet revolutionary, that Black people must free themselves from psychological oppression before they could defeat political oppression. They had to believe in their own worth, their own humanity, their own ability to define the future. Black consciousness spread like wildfire. It moved beyond the campuses and into the townships, the communities where Black South Africans lived under constant state surveillance and poverty. The message gave people pride. It gave them courage to challenge apartheid in ways both small and large. By 1972, Steve Biko and others formed the Black People's Convention, uniting many groups under the banner of Black consciousness. For the apartheid government, this was a dangerous development. The authorities knew that if Black South Africans began to see themselves not as victims, but as leaders of their own destiny, the entire apartheid structure could collapse. In 1973, they tried to silence Biko by banning him. This meant he was prohibited from speaking publicly, from writing openly, from gathering with others. Yet, even under restriction, he remained influential. He worked quietly, setting up the Zimele Trust Fund to support political prisoners and their families. The state feared him because his weapon was not guns or violence, it was ideas. His words carried power, and his philosophy gave the oppressed hope. That was enough for the government to see him as a threat. He was arrested multiple times, often held without trial, each time emerging more committed to the struggle. On August 18, 1977, Steve Biko was arrested once more, this time at a roadblock in Port Elizabeth. He was detained alongside a fellow activist. Less than a month later, the world would learn of his tragic fate. On September 11th, He was found naked, shackled, and gravely injured outside a Pretoria hospital, over 700 miles from where he had first been detained. The next day, September 12, 1977, he died from a massive brain hemorrhage caused by severe head injuries. He was only 30 years old. The apartheid government claimed there had been no foul play, no mistreatment. But the truth was impossible to hide. Evidence showed he had been brutally beaten while in custody. His death became a rallying cry, a symbol of the inhumanity of apartheid. Around the world, outrage grew. In South Africa, his name became synonymous with resistance. Years later, in 1997, after the fall of apartheid, 5 former police officers admitted they had been responsible for his death. They applied for amnesty before the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, the body tasked with uncovering the crimes of the apartheid era. Yet, in 1999, amnesty was denied. Still, for many, justice was never fully served. Decades passed, and the wound remained raw. On September 12, 2025, exactly 48 years after his death, South Africa's National Prosecuting Authority reopened the investigation into his killing. For some, this reopening was long overdue. For others, it was proof that history, though painful, cannot simply be buried. To understand Biko's significance, one must also understand the system he fought against. Apartheid officially began in 1948, when the National Party came to power. But racial segregation in South Africa had existed long before that. What the National Party did was formalize and extend it into nearly every aspect of life. The Population Registration Act of 1950 categorized all South Africans into racial groups: white, black, colored, or Asian. These categories decided where you could live, work, and go to school. The Group Areas Act further divided the country, reserving prime urban land for whites and forcing black South Africans into separate, often impoverished areas. Families were uprooted, communities destroyed. By the 1950s and 1960s, the government had also created the Bantustans, homelands where black South Africans were forced to become citizens, stripping them of South African citizenship. This was designed to make them foreigners in their own land. Pass laws required black South Africans to carry documents to justify their presence in so-called white areas. Failure to produce a pass could result in arrest, fines, or worse. Education was also deliberately restricted. The Bantu Education Act ensured that black children were trained only for manual labor and menial jobs. The system was designed to keep the majority poor, uneducated, and dependent on the minority. Apartheid laws also invaded the most personal aspects of life. Mixed marriages and interracial relationships were outlawed. Political opposition was crushed under the Suppression of Communism Act, which labeled almost any form of resistance as communist. Police were granted broad powers to detain, torture, and even kill, often without consequences. This was the world Steve Biko lived in, and it was the world he challenged with words, ideas, and courage. His black consciousness philosophy was not about hate or revenge. It was about dignity. It was about saying, "We are human. We are worthy. We refuse to be defined by the oppressor's gaze." Biko's influence extended far beyond South Africa. Around the world, his death drew attention to the brutality of apartheid. Musicians, writers, and filmmakers honored him. Donald Woods, a South African journalist who was a close friend of Biko, wrote the book, Biko, later adapted into the 1987 film, Cry Freedom. Musicians like Peter Gabriel immortalized his name in songs that inspired generations. Even after his death, the seeds of black consciousness continued to grow. They influenced the youth of Soweto, who in 1976 rose in defiance during the Soweto uprising. Thousands of students protested against inferior education and Afrikaans being forced as the language of instruction. Their courage was fueled in part by the consciousness that Biko had nurtured. Today, more than 4 decades after his passing, Steve Biko remains a symbol of resistance. His life reminds us that true liberation begins with the mind. His story teaches that systems of oppression thrive on making people feel less than human, and that the first step to freedom is reclaiming one's dignity. Apartheid officially ended in the early 1990s, with Nelson Mandela's release and South Africa's transition to democracy. But its legacies, poverty, inequality, and racial divisions, still haunt the nation. In fact, South Africa remains one of the most unequal societies in the world. Biko's vision, however, continues to guide many, a vision of a country where dignity and humanity are not defined by race, but by justice and equality for all. Steve Biko's story is not just South Africa's story. It is a universal story. It is the story of what happens when ordinary people dare to speak truth to power, when the human spirit refuses to be crushed, when the fight for freedom demands sacrifice. His life was cut short, but his ideas live on. His voice, silenced in a prison cell, still echoes in classrooms, in communities, in the hearts of all who believe in justice. The legacy of Steve Biko reminds us of a simple truth: oppression cannot endure forever. Systems built on inequality eventually crumble, but the spirit of those who resist lives on, generation after generation. Biko once said, "The most potent weapon in the hands of the oppressor is the mind of the oppressed." And perhaps the most enduring part of his legacy is that he showed the oppressed how to free their minds, and in doing so, paved the way for the freedom of a nation.